On the final day of the 2006-2007 season, something secretly catastrophic happened in the Premier League. Carlos Tevez scored a goal that kept West Ham alive in the top flight and quietly destroyed another club. A goal made possible by one of the strangest transfers in football history. Before that game, Tevez had controversially arrived in England from the Brazilian club Corinthians through a maze of third-party deals, offshore companies, and the watchful eyes of an Iranian-born power broker named Kia, a man whose group, known as MSI, effectively owned the player while the clubs he played for merely borrowed him. And when he moved to West Ham, the Premier League didn't know any of this. Or perhaps pretended not to. Unfortunately, the club that suffered most wasn't West Ham, and it wasn't even Corinthians. It was Sheffield United, a team Tevez never played for, never met, never even thought about. They were relegated. They lost millions of dollars, lost dozens of elite talents, and they couldn't return to the Premier League for 12 long years. This is how one controversial transfer, engineered in Brazil, completed in London, and orchestrated by men in expensive suits, crushed a club that wasn't even involved. In the early 2000s, football wasn't the hyper-regulated, billionaire-owned giant it is today. The Premier League was growing fast, broadcasting deals were increasing, foreign owners were circling, and wages were rising. But the rulebook still had blind spots. English clubs operated on strict financial structures. Promotions and relegations had massive consequences. A club staying in the Premier League earned tens of millions more than those in the Championship. There are massive amounts of money that Sheffield United desperately relied on. But in South America, football finance was the Wild West. Clubs were drowning in debt. Their talent was world-class, but their accounts were not. Investors saw an opening where they could buy players, control their transfer decisions, and flip footballers like stocks. This was normal in Brazil and Argentina, but in England, it was a ticking time bomb. And the group holding the detonator was about to enter the picture, the Media Sports Investment, better known as MSI. This organization wasn't a club, an agency, or a normal investment firm. It was a hybrid and a financial experiment led publicly by Kia, a highly connected, well-spoken businessman who understood one thing better than almost anyone else. Football players were undervalued assets. MSI's business model was simple: identify the most promising young stars in South America, buy their economic rights, loan them to clubs who couldn't normally afford them, then sell them later for a huge profit. This wasn't illegal in Brazil or Argentina. In fact, it was completely accepted. Clubs didn't care who owned the player financially as long as the player helped them win, but MSI took things further. In 2004, they struck a massive deal with Corinthians, one of Brazil's biggest clubs. Suddenly, they had an influx of money. They were signing players beyond their budget, and they were competing for titles again. But at the center of the revolution was a fierce, talented, 20-year-old Argentine forward, Carlos Tevez. What MSI didn't expect was that Tevez would become too big for Brazil, which meant the next logical step was Europe. But Europe had rules that MSI did not intend to follow. Just before Carlos Tevez became the center of controversy, he was one of the most exciting young players on the planet. He had already won everything at Boca Juniors: league titles, continental trophies, and even global cups. One of Tevez's defining Brazilian performances came in the 2005 Campeonato Brasileiro, when Corinthians beat Santos 7-1. A match still circulated widely in highlight compilations to this very day. In that game, Tevez delivered a hat-trick, an assist, and a relentless display of pressing and ball carrying that made him look untouchable. He had a calm one-on-one finish, a driven shot from the edge of the box, and a close-range striker's goal after dismantling the Santos backline. The Brazilian media at the time described him as playing at a level above the league. It was this kind of performance that made him a Champions League-level striker overnight. Soon enough, MSI paid Boca Juniors for his economic rights, then moved him to Corinthians as a part of their takeover. As expected, Tevez overperformed in Brazil. He won individual awards, dragged Corinthians to a title, became a national obsession, and MSI saw dollar signs at every corner. But here was the issue. Tevez wasn't owned by Corinthians. He was owned by MSI, and MSI were planning his next move based on the business opportunity. For you see, Europe was the target. England was the jackpot, but the Premier League had a very strict rule waiting for them. No third party may influence a player or a club. This rule was designed to stop exactly what MSI was doing, making investment decisions that could impact the sporting integrity of matches. But MSI didn't intend to follow English rules. They intended to use English clubs, and one club in particular was in the perfect position to be tempted. In 2006, West Ham United wasn't a giant club. They weren't rich or glamorous, they only had heart, history, and passionate fans, but not the money to sign global superstars. Their squad was built on grit and bargain hunting. So, when Kia Joorabchian quietly approached West Ham with an offer that defied logic, how could they say no? The offer was to receive Carlos Tevez and Javier Mascherano without paying a big transfer fee. Clubs like Manchester United or Chelsea would have never touched a deal like this because their lawyers would have ripped it apart in minutes. But West Ham, they saw two elite players handed to them on a silver platter for a price they could actually afford. It felt like winning the lottery, but what West Ham didn't realize, or pretended not to realize anyway, was that MSI still owned the players. They controlled their contracts and could influence playing time, sales, as well as their career decisions. All of this violated Premier League rules, but the paperwork was intentionally vague, and the Premier League, at first glance, let the transfer through. This loophole would become the fault line of the entire upcoming disaster. So now, behind the scenes, other Premier League clubs were shocked by how West Ham could pull two massive transfers in one window. The Premier League asked some questions and West Ham insisted everything was fine. MSI stayed in the shadows and nothing ended up happening. No block, no investigation, no early punishment. Meanwhile, in Sheffield, a club with limited resources was preparing for a season-long fight for survival. A fight they believed would be decided on the pitch. A fight they assumed would be fair. They had no idea that the game had already changed, that another club had received illegal help, that a player they had never met would determine their fate, and that the decisions made in boardrooms thousands of miles away would eventually shape the end of their season. When the 2006 to 2007 Premier League season kicked off, nobody imagined it would end in hearings, accusations, lawsuits, and one of the most bitter controversies English football had ever seen. Tevez and Mascherano were at West Ham. MSI owned their economic rights. The Premier League had accepted the registration, but never truly understood the documents they were approving. And then the season began. Meanwhile, Sheffield United had a plan. Their entire plan revolved around one thing: survive by staying organized, disciplined, and above all, within the rules. On the other hand, West Ham were preparing for a very different fight. While Mascherano struggled to find a role, Tevez slowly became the heartbeat of their survival battle, but nobody knew the truth behind the scenes. West Ham had signed documents with MSI that explicitly allowed third parties to influence the club's decisions. This violated Rule U18, the rule protecting sporting integrity, and the Premier League only found out because someone inside West Ham finally cracked. By January 2007, West Ham's season was collapsing. Their manager was sacked, results were terrible, Tevez was frustrated, and Mascherano left for Liverpool. This time, the Premier League requested the real contracts, but West Ham tried to stall, amend paperwork, and keep MSI out of sight. But once officials saw the full picture, they realized something massive had just happened. West Ham knowingly broke Premier League rules. They submitted false documentation and concealed third-party control. When the punishment hearing was called, the league had two options: deduct points or fine the club. Point deduction would almost certainly relegate West Ham, and this is where the controversy rips the football world in two. April 27, 2007. The Independent Disciplinary Commission released its decision. West Ham were fined €5.5 million, the largest fine ever given by the Premier League at that time, but they were not docked points. A financial punishment for a sporting breach and a paperwork fine for a competitive advantage. The justification was based on two things. A points reduction would punish the fans, and the panel believed West Ham were already unlikely to benefit from Tevez. That second punishment turned out to be disastrously wrong because Tevez was about to single-handedly keep West Ham in the Premier League, and one club was about to pay the price. After the verdict, Tevez transformed, playing with freedom, fire, and desperation. He scored crucial goals and dragged West Ham to shock wins, including one over Arsenal. Somehow, West Ham moved from the bottom of the table, and Sheffield United could feel the ground shifting beneath them. May 13, 2007, Premier League Survival Sunday. Sheffield United needed a win, and West Ham needed a miracle at Old Trafford. What happened next became a football legend. Carlos Tevez scored the winning goal against Manchester United, the goal that kept West Ham safe with 41 points. On the other hand, Sheffield United lost their match and finished the league with 38 points. The margins were 3 points, a single goal difference swing, and one player who should not have been eligible under Premier League rules. Unfortunately, Sheffield United were relegated, with millions of pounds in revenue lost, jobs threatened, and a club's future thrown right into chaos. West Ham survived thanks to a player whose contract broke the rules, and the outrage from fans and lovers of the game was completely out of control. The football world practically tore itself apart. Sheffield fans attacked the Premier League for letting them pay for another club's cheating. West Ham fans claimed it wasn't the players' fault and the supporters shouldn't be punished for boardroom mistakes. But above all, everyone agreed on one thing. The punishment definitely did not fit the crime. Sheffield United launched appeal after appeal with arbitration panels, FA hearings, and high court reviews. At every stage, the same truth emerged. West Ham broke the rules, they gained a sporting advantage, and the Premier League panel made the wrong call. But none of the appeals could award the one thing Sheffield United wanted: reinstatement to the Premier League. The season couldn't be rewound, fixtures couldn't be replayed, and the table couldn't be rewritten. So compensation became the only practical solution, and the fight turned from ethics to money. For years, the dispute raged on. Sheffield United argued they lost more than 50 million euros. West Ham argued Tevez wasn't responsible for every result. Independent panels reviewed the data and every point, every match, every goal. But the deed was already done. The Tevez affair didn't just shame the Premier League, it completely changed it. After that unfortunate event, many rules were rewritten, third-party ownership was banned outright, and clubs demanded transparency. The Premier League swore it would never allow this again, but the truth is more complex. The system barely survived. By the time lawyers left the room and the checks were signed, the damage had already been carved into the history books. Most clubs accept relegation, but Sheffield United didn't. They refused to let a rule breach be treated like a parking ticket. They refused to accept that a €5.5 million fine was justice. And they refused to let the Premier League draw a line under a controversy that wasn't actually resolved. So they fought. Years of arbitration finally led to the inevitable outcome. West Ham agreed to a settlement reportedly worth around €20 million, paid to Sheffield United over several years. It was one of the costliest scandals in Premier League history, but money could never erase the bitterness. It was the closest thing to an admission the sport would ever give. What it couldn't do was give Sheffield the one thing they actually lost: 12 years of opportunity. Relegation is not simply about playing in a different league. It is a financial earthquake that reshapes a club's entire future. In 2007, Premier League clubs were already earning €30 to €50 million per season from broadcast deals. However, the Championship offered barely a fraction of that. That gap affects budgets, transfers, youth investment, stadium upgrades, wage structures, and long-term competitiveness. Sheffield United were forced to sell key players including Phil Jagielka, who left and became an Everton legend, Michael Tong, Rob Hulse, and Paddy Kenny. The club rebuilt and rebuilt again. Managers came and went, ownership changed, and eventually they reached the Premier League in 2019. Imagine 1 decade of missed top-flight money. Imagine 12 consecutive years of lower sponsorships. Imagine 12 years of fewer matchday visitors, fewer commercial deals, fewer opportunities. No lawyer can quantify that. But after the dust settled, the scandal produced clear winners: West Ham. Moreover, MSI and Jodopchian walked away with profits, moved their operations abroad, and continued representing and moving players at the highest levels. Key became an advisor to major Premier League transfers for years afterward, hardly the outcome you'd expect for the central figure in a scandal to this degree. There was no downfall, no exile, and no football-ending punishment. As for Carlos Tevez, he got the biggest win of all. In 2007, he moved to Manchester United, won the Premier League, won the Champions League, and became one of the most iconic forwards of his generation. The season meant to define his downfall became the rocket that launched him into superstardom. Meanwhile, FIFA decided to take matters into their own hands, officially banning third-party transactions in 2015. The very business model MSI used to control Tevez and Mascherano became illegal across global football. The system that allowed this scandal to exist was dismantled, but the people who benefited from that system, they were never punished. Not really. It turns out the football gods don't always deliver poetic justice.